My name is Kirsty. Welcome to Australia at Home. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'm on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded and this is and always will be Aboriginal land, and pay respects to elders past and present of each of the countries you're all on as well, and acknowledge that this crisis exacerbates existing injustices, and that is true for First Nations people. From the overcrowding we heard about with a few sessions ago in housing, meaning that people are more vulnerable to disease, through the over-policing of First Nations communities that we had Roxanne Moore from NATSLs talking about a couple of days ago. It's on all of us to figure out how we can work in solidarity with First Nations communities for self-determination and sovereignty. So my name is Kirsty and I'm the Executive Director at Australian Progress, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's Australia at Home session. These happen every weekday at 1 o'clock, and today we've got, for the first time ever, Mehreen Faruqi, Senator with the Greens, having a conversation with her son, actually, very amazing journalist, Osman Faruqi, and editor of the 7am podcast. So it's going to be an exciting session, but just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into it. So I'd recommend, if you can, for most of the time, please have your video on. This Australia at Home exists to be a space where people can come together and have conversations about how this pandemic is affecting different communities, and a place to cheer each other on. So please turn your mic and your video on if you can. I would recommend in the top right corner going to gallery view. So there's 9 little squares in the top right corner. If you click on that, you'll get to see everybody's face. I'd like to introduce the tech team. So we've got Hannah doing tech support in the chat, and you can see that down the bottom. So if you need any help with tech at any point, you can message in the chat. And we've got tech, Hannah and Jess behind the scenes. And if you could use the chat now to introduce yourself, so let everyone know who you are, what your name is. If you're part of an organisation, you can do so in the chat now. We'll keep you on mute for most of the time, but we want Australia at Home to be a space that's interactive. And so if you have any questions or comments at any point, you can put them in the chat and we can bring you up and you can ask your question via video, or Osman can ask it to Mehreen on your behalf. A few other little housekeeping things. So this will be recorded and we'll share it around afterwards. And Australia at Home is hosted by a number of organisations, including Essential, Australian Progress, The Guardian, Principal Co, the Community Council of Australia and Australian Conservation Foundation. And like I said, it's every 1 o'clock on weekdays. So I think that's all the logistics and welcome, but welcome everyone. And I'm very excited to hand over to Osman Faruqi, like I said, a journalist and editor of 7am podcast, who will be interviewing today Mehreen Faruqi, who is a Green senator, but also the first Australian Muslim woman elected to Australian Parliament, and very important timing in Ramadan at the moment. So I'm very excited to hear about this, and Mehreen also holds the housing and education portfolios for the Greens. So some very important issues going on in this crisis. But I'll hand over to you now, Osman.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Thanks for asking me to host this conversation, and thanks to all of you who've joined to listen and to watch. It's very cool to see a lot of familiar names of friends and colleagues. So thanks for spending your lunch with us. And hi, Mum. How you doing?
Hey, Oz. I'm good. I'm very excited as well to be here. And I was saying earlier, a little bit nervous. I know Oz is a pretty tough journalist, so we'll see how this one goes.
Yeah. No, you're right to be a bit nervous, actually. I'm not going to... You're the woman who raised me. It's actually the first time I think we've video conferenced during this whole pandemic. It's sort of interesting that it took Kirsty and Australian Progress and Australia at Home to make this happen. But you know, I think it's if anything, it's a good opportunity to catch up with you. I've been missing your cooking in particular. You've been putting up a lot of delicious food on Instagram that I look at, and then I look at my Uber Eats Thai, pad Thai that I've ordered for the 9th night in a row. It's really rammed home how much I miss your cooking lately.
Yeah, it is that time where so many families, I think, are split apart and lonely. Like you're in Melbourne, my daughter's in the US, my mother's kind of stuck in Pakistan. So it is that time where we, I guess, realize what family and love means more than at other times.
Yeah, and so over the course of the conversation, we're going to talk on a bunch of different things related to the moment that we're living in, the kind of society that I think the pandemic has, I guess, exposed that we all operate in, and what the opportunities and challenges might be in terms of grappling with what it's laid bare and where we think those fault lines are. But maybe to kick off, I would love to get a sense from you, Mum, what you think the lay of the land is like now. And I guess, like, in terms of putting some context around that, when the virus first started to hit, we heard a lot. The conversation then was, this is it's a disease. It impacts everyone the same. Everyone can be hit. We're all in this together. And then as times moved on, I think some of that started to rub off a little bit. People started to understand that the economic consequences in particular, but also the health and social consequences weren't necessarily hitting everyone exactly the same. If you look back on the last couple of months, what do you think the pandemic has sort of shown us about the kind of society that we live in here in Australia?
Before I go to the question, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I am on, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. We are all on stolen land. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So of course, the last 2 months, and I can't believe that it's only been 2 months, I have to say, it seems so much longer because so much has happened. We started off with, we're all in this together. And I think as a community, as people, we have really shown solidarity and we have fared a lot better in terms of some of the consequences of the pandemic on health, especially, than other countries in the world. Governments initially stepped in very quickly and announced these big packages. But there is absolutely no doubt that this pandemic has, exposed and, further laid bare the existing inequalities in society, the inequalities between those on precarious work, people on casual works or insecure work, and those with permanent jobs, those who are on different visa categories in Australia. Like your visa has now become a determinant in this time of, whether you get any financial support or whether you're kind of left on your own. There's many other cases as well in terms of students, for instance, again, whether you're a domestic student or whether you're an Australian student determines when and how you get support. And those issues have really, for me, been very personal because part of the fact is that they are my portfolios. And the other fact is that a lot of people who are suffering at the moment are migrants or, who come from places that I come from, for instance, the subcontinent. And so I guess you have to think about why those people have been left behind. And I've been kind of pondering that question quite a lot as well. Like when the government drew the line, why was the line drawn in terms of, people of color suffering more, for instance? I mean, another inequality that has been exposed and highlighted is the gender inequality, of course, as well. We know that women are losing jobs much faster and many more when compared to men. We also know that women are on the front line of this crisis as nurses, as teachers, and they have to bear more of the brunt of health and social impacts. For instance, they're childcare workers. In terms of migrant workers, they are workers in the hospitality industry. They are workers in the cleaning industry. And those are the industry that have really kind of borne the brunt in terms of job losses. And they're left high and dry without any government support, unlike other countries, I have to say, like the UK and Canada, who have actually stumped up and looked at this in a very humane way and said, we will give support to everyone who is in this country and who needs that support. And so it's very stark now where the inequalities lie. And from my perspective, there is absolutely no way that we should ever be thinking of going back to where we were before the pandemic.
I mean, do you think, how optimistic are you that like other people have the issues that you're talking about, the issues of inequality in the gender space and when it comes to migrants and people from more diverse backgrounds, do you think that that is something that is cutting through in terms of how Australians understand what the crisis is doing? The government's approval rating, for example, is, you know, at sky highs. There hasn't been a government this popular in a very long time in Australia. And by and large, a lot of the, I guess, analysis of how this government has navigated the way through the crisis, because I think it's focused quite fairly on the health elements of it, are quite good. It's, you know, it's a lot of praise for the way that the government's navigated through this, and the issues that you're highlighting and are being highlighted by various other groups around the country are being raised. But do you think that people by and large understand the inequality that you're describing, or do you think that's still a challenge?
I think more people have recognized the inequalities, but absolutely it is a huge challenge on how to close that gap between the inequalities. That's always been a challenge here for us and in other places in the world as well. I mean, I'll give you one example. I spoke out about gender, the issues of gender inequality and how the pandemic was affecting women more about 2 months ago when the pandemic started. And I was hung out to dry by the right-wing media. They criticized me on pretty much every media channel they had, made fun of me and said that I was playing identity politics. So that's just one example. I mean, we just saw recently, a couple of days ago, the employment minister saying, you know, I thought it was making fun in some ways, you know, have a curry for the country, and said that Indian food was her favorite food, while at the same time, I hope they realize, but maybe they don't, that where the food is coming from are the exact people who have been, you know, left out of any support, who are the ones who don't have jobs. So she won't be able to enjoy her curry for much longer if, you know, support isn't given. But I do think that people are fired up at this point, at least in the community. I don't see it yet in the decision makers in Parliament, but I think the people I speak to, and you know, I think I've been speaking to more people now during the lockdown than probably I was before, when I was going out every night to see the community face to face. The community is really fired up and want to make sure that, you know, we don't go to that, what people are calling the normal before. But it's going to be a tough ask, because the government, it seems, is going to get even worse than business as usual. On social justice issues and on issues of the climate crisis. And let's not forget that's still waiting for us and exacerbating as we speak. It hasn't gone away. And yet the government is unleashing, you know, approvals for more fossil fuel projects, removing regulations, and talking about really failed kind of projects like carbon capture now, and funding them even more. So the challenge is huge. But I think the community is up for it. And I, for one, have become even more determined in the last 2 months to make sure that I give it my all to do something. That's kind of why I'm in politics.
You know, someone's a good politician when they pivot a question about COVID-19 inequality to fossil fuels and the importance of investing. That's very impressive.
I think that's very interrelated, even though people, no. I know my mom the other day was talking, you know, people are talking about the silver lining. And I was talking to your grandma in Pakistan the other day, and she was saying that she was sitting in a front yard and she had never seen birds like she's seeing now, you know, even the type of birds, or that she saw stars in the sky in Lahore for the first time in literally decades. Because they'd always been kind of blanketed by a cover of pollution. But of course, like a pandemic is not the answer. Loneliness and death is not the answer to improve our environment. This goes much deeper. And they are, the health crisis, the economic crisis, the social justice crisis, and the climate crisis. You cannot separate them.
Before we, move away from this idea, you're talking about the cohorts that were being left behind. One of the things that has kind of struck me is they're not actually small numbers of people, whether it's the casual workers who missed out from the job keeper legislation, nearly 1 million of them, or international students and those on temporary work visas, another 1 million. Like, we're talking millions of people who are facing poverty, homelessness. Surveys show that a huge number of them are skipping meals. There's been footage and photos of thousands of international students lining up for free food parcels every day, which is just not a scene that I ever expected to see in my lifetime in Australia. And you touched on some of the reasons why you think that might be, but one thing that you sort of didn't mention, which I personally think is very interesting, something I think about a lot, you yourself came to Australia as a university student, as a temporary, migrant in that regard. I wonder, and that was not really the same thing, but when you and Dad first came, and I was, just a little kid, you made it through the recession in the early 90s. Dad couldn't get work and drove taxis for a long time, despite having, multiple engineering degrees. Like, what, based on your experiences then and what we're seeing now, what do you think it is about this group of people that means that they so often aren't the ones taken care of? The country sort of sees them, and maybe it's obvious, maybe it's just to do with like this country's inability to acknowledge international students as anything other than cash cows, or temporary workers as anything other than people who do work for low pay. But why do you think that is? Given how long this country has had a history of people coming in, using, paying for university or working hard, but we still don't seem to value them as human beings. Why do you think we struggle with that?
I mean, the issue of international students, I have to say, is particularly heartbreaking. I have heard from hundreds upon hundreds of international students who, don't have money for food on the table, or their landlord wants to kick them out of the homes that they live in. And those long queues, you're absolutely right. People queuing up to get free food. This is the sort of Australia we're living in at the moment. I mean, I think migrants have always lived in inequality. Like you said, when we came under the premise that we were both engineers and there were jobs for us in Australia. But the reality was totally different. And no one would even give us a look in. Even both my husband and I had engineering degrees, which were highly recognized. And it was because we didn't have local experience. So I think there has always been that division between, who some people deem to be Australian and not. And, the both major party, and, the two-party system is a huge problem, but we'll talk about that another time. But both the parties, one overtly and the other, keep dog whistling about temporary migrants or permanent migrants. We just saw Labour Party doing that, taking jobs from Australian workers. Well, we're living here. We are in Australia. We are Australian workers. And I guess with this, I've been thinking about international students in particular and temporary visa holders. I mean, one of the key reasons I think is they can't vote. So, they just disregard it because and that again goes to the democratic system that we live in, that it's a very representative democracy in Australia. There is no participation in democracy as such. People who go to vote go every 3 or 4 years, and then the government thinks they have the mandate to do whatever they want to without actually thinking about their communities and the people who live in those communities.
Yeah, and that sort of leads me into the other area. One of the portfolios you have is education, and there's been a lot of conversation and focus and analysis and journalism and what's happening in the higher education space in particular. And that's an area where the government has over the past few decades, not necessarily kept up investment, at least relative to other OECD countries, and universities have turned to international students as a supply line, essentially, and a way to keep investment up in the sector. And that tap has essentially been turned off as a result of the pandemic and border closures. And now universities are struggling. Casuals have been laid off, short-term contractors have been laid off, and the university sector is facing, I think, what is fair to say is an unprecedented crisis. And the government has responded by actually changing the regulations around the JobKeeper wage subsidies to stop universities accessing that payment. Before we maybe talk about like what that means for the university sector, just to pivot from that other question as to why, like, I think it's an interesting point that you raised that, international students, temporary workers can't vote. And perhaps that's why they're a constituency the government doesn't want to listen to, but university academics can vote. People who study at university, domestic students can vote. People who benefit from research can vote. Why do you think the university sector is not been factored into the economic conversations?
The universities is another thing that is very near and dear to my heart. If people would ask me when I was young what I wanted to do, it was never become a politician. That happened, it was always to teach. And I was very lucky enough to be an academic for many years at the University of New South Wales. So I'll come back to my experiences and what's happening in the university. But going to the question of, yes, why universities? Why does this government have an agenda against the universities? And they do. There's ideological warfare against intellectualism, against critical open thinking, and that's why against universities. We saw this last year, this government vetoing grants, which were to do with arts. The minister, this was also unprecedented. The minister actually intervened and stopped ARC grants from going to projects, which they didn't like when, so there is definitely an ideological warfare going on with universities. But, my experience with universities, and I saw this happening, universities turning from institutions of, public good towards corporations, where students were customers, staff were service providers, where they were all competing with each other for, the domestic student market and the international student market. I mean, I saw in my 10 years at university, casualization becoming rampant, and all in this drive for, productivity and efficiency. And now look what's happened. We, in the university sector, in the higher education sector, we have more people on contracts and in casual work than in permanent jobs. So for me, again, that's an inequality that has been highlighted. For me, this is an opportunity to reimagine universities altogether. And it's governments of both persuasions who have been cutting funding to universities. I think in the early 90s, public funding for universities was around the 80% mark, and now it's less than 50%. They've been left to fend for themselves, and they've corporatized. I saw vice chancellors' salaries kind of exploding while the casual employment kept increasing by the minute. And when I say we reimagine universities, what I see it is as universities, kind of becoming places where knowledge is created, where truth is sought for. Universities are not just places where people go and are churned out to kind of get a job. I know that's an important part of education. We all have to work and live. But my father, we are 4 siblings, and my father, we all grew up in Lahore in Pakistan. And my father, who was also a university professor, said to all of us that he would really want us all to go to universities. And from his perspective, it was about opening up your mind, trying to think with clarity and trying to make decisions based on evidence. And for me, that's still the purpose of universities. It is about education. It is about public good. And universities should be free. They should be fully funded by the public. And they should be much more democratic than they are at the moment. We've seen how university life for students has really changed. I don't know, Oz, in your time as well, you may have seen that, but what student unions used to be, they can't. And my students, some of them had to do 3 jobs, especially the ones who came from the country into the city to study. They had to do 3 jobs to make ends meet. So how can they actually have a life or think outside of the shackles of, their day-to-day living? So this is what, I have been talking about and will keep talking about till the cows come home, or till they start funding universities the way they should be.
Yeah, it's like universities, partly for the reasons you said, have always been a weirdly close part of my life. Not because I'm a particularly studious or very good academic student, but when you and Dad first moved to Australia, we lived really close to the University of New South Wales, where you were both studying. And that's also where my granddad studied in the 50s, right? He came over to Australia to study engineering. So I became like a 3rd generation student of engineering at the University of New South Wales, which always shocked a lot of people because I don't think there would be that many 3rd generation students at that university. It hasn't been around that long, let alone from a migrant background. So I grew up there. I played at campus as a toddler. All your friends were academics and
in the labs as well, when the safety standards were a little bit lax, because I didn't have too much childcare, couldn't afford it. So I can remember taking you and your sister, who was a baby then, and I'm revealing this now, but this is the other thing. When you migrate to a country, you don't have those options. So yeah, you literally grew up at the University of New South Wales.
Good to know that I can blame all my weird problems on the fact that I grew up in a biology lab at a university. Yeah, thanks. Great parenting.
You're welcome.
And yeah, it's been sad for me, and I know that's not my soapbox, and you're the politician, but just on a personal level, understanding the important role that universities can play to individuals, but to society, because of the unique experiences that we had, to see this struggle and difficulty so many academics and students are dealing with right now. But one of the things that, like when you talked about the kind of intellectual warfare the government is waging against universities, it reminded me of a story I read this morning in the news that had made me angrier than I'd been in a long time, which is a no mean feat because I get quite agitated at things quite easily. But the government has called on the ABC to freeze the wages of the organisation for the next year. The ABC, I used to work at the ABC before I moved to Melbourne, and we were involved in a campaign as workers and through the union to fight for a pay rise, and we managed to get a pay rise of 2%. And the government is now saying that the ABC, as a public sector agency, should freeze its wages in a sign of solidarity with the community. And that sort of speaks to 2 things. One, the government's lack of support for the ABC and public broadcasting in general, but also the fact that the government seems to think that its way out of an economic crisis is to keep wages low, when the start of this was the government saying, well, we have to keep money in the economy. We have to have programs like JobKeeper to keep the economy going. But now it seems to be saying, well, we've got an economic, we've got a budget crisis. It's time to hit pause. I personally don't understand how they think that is a way, like that's something that people will support. Surely people don't want to try and deal with an economic situation like this by accepting pay cuts. I wonder what your view is based on the conversations you have with people in the community and constituents.
Yeah, well, austerity is not going to get us out of this crisis. That's for sure. And just talking about JobKeeper, I didn't answer your question properly about the universities and how they're not getting JobKeeper. So I'll quickly touch on that as well. So the university changed the government changed the rules 3 times to literally ensure that no university and their staff would have access to JobKeeper. Universities are now set to lose 30,000 jobs. Yesterday, I was questioning the COVID committee, which is a committee that has been set up for scrutiny while Parliament is sitting, kind of very sporadically. And I asked the Department of Education how many jobs had been lost in universities, and they looked around, opened up their iPads and all, and the answer they gave me was none. So this is how kind of connected and concerned they are about universities. Of course, people don't want to take, cuts to pay. And of course, public servants shouldn't be asked to take cuts in pay. Here, the in Australia, we actually haven't even had that debate of, if there should be pay cuts, should politicians be the ones to lead that debate and say, that they should take pay cuts in their salaries? And, it's the goal of the government to ask public servants to take pay cuts. The way out of the situation we are in is actually to start investing in reviving the things that we think have been lagging previous to the pandemic, like, rebuilding universities and TAFEs, like building renewable energy, like building the public housing sector. We are in strife in terms of housing because there isn't affordable housing here. The advocates say that we need 500,000 homes at least in the public and community housing space over the next some years, if we are to make sure that no one is without a home. We can actually borrow money. Debt and deficit are not dirty words at all. And, the government has the capacity to kind of borrow at a very low interest rate with bonds. And, people often compare government debt to debt that we all have on our credit cards or as home loans. It's two entirely different things, but they like to conflate that. If we actually look at debt of comparable countries, we have so much less debt than other countries. So we have the capacity really to borrow some money and to actually invest the money in industries of the future. That really excites me as an engineer. I just think we can really rebuild green industry in Australia and not let young people who have studied renewable energy or other kind of degrees to go overseas and kind of use their talent there because they couldn't find jobs here. And I was shocked actually to see a couple of weeks ago, one of the newspapers had a headline in one of their articles, which was like one of the hospitals in Sydney. The staff were actually making their own personal protective equipment. So, I mean, really, this is where we are at. And I'm not saying that we start making everything that we need in Australia, but there's so much opportunity in terms of green steel, or, batteries or, other advanced technology. We can actually do that and create really good, decent jobs in those industries as well.
I think we have a question from someone that we might ask them to say. This is the first time I've thrown to a question in one of these things. So Alyssa, you have a question. Are you able to be unmuted and ask it?
Thank you. And thank you so much for the discussion today. I was just really interested on the Greens' perspective on Nev Power, obviously heading up the Coburg Commission, what that means for, I guess, launching Australia into not snapping back, but sort of stepping forward into green energy, and what you guys are planning to do about it. Seems like a bit of a setback.
Thanks, Alyssa. Just before you answer that, so just a really quick context, Scott Morrison in March announced a National COVID Commission that was to chart Australia's economic recovery out of the crisis, and the head of that commission is Neville Power, who's a former CEO of Fortescue Metals, and he sits on the board of Strike Energy, which is a gas mining company. So I guess there's been some discussion about whether his personal interests in the fossil fuel sector might be influencing potential government policy. Yeah, so what are the Greens going to do about it?
Thanks for that question, Alyssa, and thanks for coming today as well. So we don't have any formal kind of say in the commission, but it is very concerning what the commission is coming up with. We've seen over the last couple of days, them recommending more fossil fuel extraction in terms of gas, which is only going to exacerbate climate change. And, when you have people on a commission involved who have vested interests, then that's the kind of result that you're going to get. So for me, I think a couple of weeks ago or a month ago, I thought, that there was not going to be a snapback, because some of the things that we have seen from, a neoliberal government are things that the Greens have been pushing for, like free childcare, banning evictions at this time or raising the rate. So those are the things that we want to really retain, but it's not looking very likely. So I'm really a bit distressed at this point in time, I have to say. the power that a political party like the Greens has, and that's why I joined the Greens, is the power of the movement, is the power of working with the community to creating the changes that we want created. So we're still kind of working very hard on that. We just released a couple of days ago a plan for recovery, which includes the things that we were speaking about earlier, you know, renewable energy, green industry, you know, a job guarantee for people, and actually retaining the rate at what it is now, because no one can survive on $40 a day, or free childcare. We have seen that these things can happen. They have happened. And so we need to make sure that more and more people realize that. So it is about growing the movement as grassroots as we can, and pushing the government through that.
Before we move from the inequality topic, I think Alyssa's question is really interesting. It sort of fits into this framework of, you know, well, the crisis sort of presents this opportunity to build the sort of society we want. But in practicality, what we're seeing is the government shift towards, you know, not the renewable energy future that a lot of people are advocating for, but reopening of the gas industry and the economic space, you know, waging war against universities and public broadcasting. And you know, when we were talking about pay freezes before, someone pointed out that the New South Wales government is also pushing for wage freezes on public servants like teachers and nurses. So at every level of government across the country, the crisis is being used by those on the conservative side to just wage their, you know, ideological battles. The Greens, you know, you're not the opposition, but you're not an insignificant party. You have 10 MPs, senators, you have hundreds of staff, you've got MPs around the country, you work closely with unions and environment groups. Like what is, like, do you think the Greens are doing enough in terms of advocating for the kind of country or society you want to build? And what do you think it actually looks like? Like, I understand you said the Greens released a plan earlier this week, but how do you convince people of that plan? How do you get elements of that plan up in Parliament implemented?
So I guess in Parliament, we have to work with others. A big part of the role that the Greens play, and I've always believed in that role, is to shift some of the other parties, and in particular the Labour Party, to change their position on things. So for instance, you know, last week in Parliament, we were really pushing to have the parts of the JobKeeper regulation, which stopped universities from accessing JobKeeper, the wage subsidy, to be disallowed. So we made a big hoo-ha of that, and Labour came on board, and we convinced a few other crossbenchers. So kind of those are parliamentary tactics. But I think outside of Parliament is exactly what you said. We have been working with unions, we have been working with environmental groups, we have been working with the community, but we need to make it much bigger and much broader. And there's never, I think I would never say that we are doing enough. There is always more to do. So from my perspective, what we need is a huge public investment in all these things that will close the inequality gap, that will ensure that, you know, we have, I guess, a society where work is about life making. It is not about profit making. And I know I might sound a bit ideological, but I have always been a bit ideological. And I think there's nothing wrong with having a goal that you actually believe in.
Do you think, and sorry, I know I said that was my last question, inequality, but I actually have one more just to push you on this front. So I think everything you said, you know, it's fair enough. When you look at the last few polls, and, you know, people have their own views on the accuracy of polling or otherwise, and it's obviously a complex time. The government seems to be tracking okay. Like Scott Morrison himself is receiving a lot of support. The government is, you know, it's kind of 50-50, neck and neck with Labor. The Greens are sort of still where they've been for a bit, between 9 and 10%. So far, it doesn't seem like there's a broad section of the community that think that things are going the wrong way. They seem pretty happy with what's going on. And they certainly aren't yet seeing, okay, wow, I'm really worried about these issues. The Greens have got a plan. I'm going to throw my support in that direction. Do you think, like, do you accept that sort of analysis? And what do you think the Greens or any progressive, you know, organization could do shift the dial in that space?
I do accept part of that analysis. I do accept that, you know, the Greens have been on 10, 12% of the vote for some time now. And, you know, and we have been thinking and talking about why and what we can do. So I guess voting and the percentage of voting is one thing. We are a political party. Of course, we want to increase our representation and our vote. But changes can happen without us having a majority vote as well. And that has happened over time as well in various ways. You know, the Banking Royal Commission, changes in animal welfare. You know, there's many other examples, you know, that we can think of. But from, like, I think we need to have a no holds barred kind of situation here, where the Greens are really bold in advocating for the things that we think are necessary to do. For instance, I'll give you one example. Just last week, Adam Bant and I signed a letter that was being pushed by, and a campaign that was being pushed by Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders from the US to actually cancel all the debt that the IMF and the World Bank has on you know, developing countries. I want Australia to cancel all the debt that Pacific countries owe us. So I think we have to be really bold, not be afraid of the right-wing media criticizing us. And we need to grow our movement. And that also needs to be more open to having the difficult conversations with people we haven't had with before. There's no point in talking to ourselves. I mean, there is a point that we build the, you know, solidarity, but really we need to talk to communities we haven't really engaged in before. For instance, you know, multicultural communities, communities of color. And we really need to do things that we haven't done before to push those boundaries.
Speaking of multiculturalism, so a lot of, you know, we'll have time for questions at the end of this chat. And I think a lot of the questions coming through are on this question of political strategy and how we fight and that sort of stuff. So we're not going to disappear from that topic. But just before we get there, you mentioned multiculturalism and different communities. Obviously, it's Ramadan at the moment, a holy month for Muslims. And I got very sad just thinking, out of all the things that this crisis has taken away, one of the highlights of last year for me was spending a lot of time and making a little mini doco with the ABC on the Lakemba night markets in Sydney, which are one of the best things, I think, to display how good multiculturalism is. A super diverse part of Sydney that every night from, you know, 6 o'clock to the early hours of the morning is full of food from Bangladesh to Pakistan to the Middle East, to Indonesia. And it's such a fun way to celebrate with, you know, people from different backgrounds. And obviously that hasn't happened. You've still been fasting during Ramadan. And a lot of people probably don't understand. They just think of it as it's an opportunity to not eat and to reflect on yourself. But it's also very much about community and very much about being together with family when you break those fasts. I wonder what it's been like for you to have to navigate that in such an isolating period, or if you've spoken to family and friends about how they're dealing with that during this time.
Yeah, 3 days to go and then Eid on Sunday. But Ramadan for me has two aspects always, the personal one and the social one. So on the personal one, I think it hasn't changed much. It is about reflection. It is about contemplation. You know, it is about thinking more bigger picture. That's the part of the reflection. It is about thinking of people who may not be as lucky as you in life and may not have the things, the resources that you have in life. And I think at this time, especially during the pandemic, that sense has been heightened manyfold as you see people around you really suffering. And as I said earlier, for me, it has made me even more determined to fight harder, you know, for those issues. But on the social side of things, it has been utter crap. I have to say that. It's been so horrible. And to be really frank, ever since moving from Pakistan to Australia, and that's been almost 30 years now, I can't believe it. Ramadan never has been the same for me. Because in a country like Pakistan, where a vast majority of people, it's kind of geared towards Ramadan. It's like party time. It's a party every night. You know, everything's open all night, and you know, it's a huge part of the social system. But even in Australia, you know, there were iftars. You know, every other day, I would host an iftar. So it is a lot about engaging with community. So that has been a very sad aspect of it. And also Eid as well. There will be no prayers at the mosque. We can only probably have 5 or 6 people at Eid, but across the world at the same situation. I've been talking to relatives in Pakistan, in the US, in the UK. It's been pretty isolating for a lot of people. Everyone's doing their best, but obviously it's not the same.
Yeah, and just, you know, I'm not fasting. I haven't fasted in a long time. But thanks for not holding that against me and you know, thinking of me as a failure.
Wag my finger at yours.
I've got to have that terrible Uber Eats pad thai, you know, food is really important. But no, thanks for touching on that. I think it's something, you know, everyone has their own unique, I guess, struggles through this in terms of how we live and how we interact with one another, and faith and religion is a part of that. And yeah, Ramadan is such a unifying, and Eid in particular is a unifying moment. It's just so strange to think that for the first time in most people's lives, that's not something that they can do collectively. But we've got some questions from people. Thank you for sending them in. We've got a bit of time to do it. Kelly Marks, hello, nice to hear from you, comrade. Asked if Mehreen can comment on the Zali-Steggall bill. I imagine that's the climate bill. What you think the pros and cons of that bill are?
Lovely to see you. Again, that seems like a lifetime ago, the Zali-Steggall bill and the debate. So I'll have to jog my memory on that. I think from our perspective, when we looked at it, any move forward to improve the situation that is in Australia, which is kind of a very low bar, to be really frank, is a good move. But obviously that bill is not going to take us to where we need to go, because what we really need is to have basically 100% renewables in Australia, and that's not going to do it. So that's our position, that we had agreed to support that bill, but obviously push for much, much more. I mean, it is a difficult parliament in that sense that we don't have the balance of power anywhere. Like when I say we, with the Greens. So we need the Labour Party and all of the crossbenchers, literally, to move anything. And that's a really difficult situation in terms of legislation. But I think those sorts of pieces of legislation also are very important to create debate in Parliament and outside Parliament. And that serve the purpose, because people, as you know, they know the Greens' position. But if anyone else has a positive thing to say about climate change, often that triggers another discussion on it. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, this Zali-Steggall bill was really interesting because it felt like, even though it wasn't, you know, a super radical bill, it did create, you know, a space for discussion, and you started to see some coalition MPs moving towards that position. And for the first time in a very long time, I guess since the Abbott government's election, you started to see a little bit of momentum moving towards climate action. And then, of course, COVID-19 struck, and, you know, where we are, as we were talking about before. Denise and Carol in the comments have been chatting a bit about the need for progressives, whether that's political parties, campaigners, groups, to develop their own channels or ways to speak to the community. Because, you know, you were talking, Mum, about the influence of the right-wing media. You know, I'm a journalist. I'm kind of aware of the power of the media, the limitations of the media. How you think that progressive organizations in this context, you know, can get better at communicating directly to people?
And yes, you know, media has cut the Greens out completely, almost, over the last 2 months. And I see Kelly smiling, because Kelly's worked in media, and it's always been very hard for us to get the media, but we do whatever we can. I think we are these days, though, a little luckier that you can directly communicate to people. And that's what the Greens have been doing. We have, through social media mainly. And, you know, I've attended meetings and even been to a rally on Zoom in the last couple of months.
I've only been to nightclubs on Zoom. I haven't done anything anywhere near as exciting as that. Sorry.
Well, there you go. No, yeah, I could say I haven't done anything as exciting as going to Zoom was. And that's what I think we need to do more and more of talk to people directly. You know, I am old-fashioned in some ways. I still love my door knocking. I know we can't do door knocking during this time, but I've always been, you know, an avid fan of talking to people face to face. I think that's because 3-word slogans are not going to bring people on board, are not going to change what we want changed. It is those conversations where we can actually unpack some of these issues and convince people in a different direction, or be convinced. You know, you've got to keep your mind open as well as to what the best ways are of talking about these things or doing these things. So I think those direct channels have really helped us. We have like thousands and thousands of people who we can directly contact, and those numbers have been growing over this time.
Great. We have a question from Rebecca Highland. What more would you like to see the Greens do to encourage representatives from minority communities to engage with the party or run for pre-selection? I guess the context of that is like, you know, as Kirsty mentioned, you're the first Muslim woman in the federal Senate, but you're also one of 10 Green MPs in the federal parliament, the only one from, you know, a migrant background or who is a person of color. The Greens are not a party that are particularly known for their diversity in parliament or their connections to migrant groups around. So how do you think the Greens can improve that? And would you like to see more people of color put their hand up?
Oh, absolutely, I would. Absolutely, I would. But you know, it's not easy. So I'll answer it in a couple of different ways. It's not easy being a migrant or a person of color and being in a political party. Like, it took me 12 years after we came to Australia to even think about, you know, doing community service or getting involved in the community. It takes that time to, you know, get a job, find a house, you know, settle your life. Yeah, it's just very hard.
But is it just about the difficulties migrants face, or do you think there are issues from the other side as well in terms of the way that political parties can seem? And I'm just going to focus specifically on the Greens because that's what the question was, and that's the part of it you're representing. That's a party that seems to have struggled for a long time, in particular, to connect. Yeah. Sorry, you're just muted at the moment. I think we just missed it.
Yeah, so yeah, I was coming to that. The Greens are by no means a diverse party. I think we have the best policies, because when I looked at, you know, thinking of joining a political party or voting for a political party and looked at the policies, why I aligned with the Greens was because when I read about what they did or what they actually did in practice in Parliament, you know, Bob Brown, Kerry Nettle at that time, heckling George Bush, for instance, and having such strong policies on refugees. That's what kind of drew me to the Greens, apart from, obviously, I'm an environmental engineer as well, and, you know, very passionate about that side of things. But yeah, when I joined the party, I figured, and maybe at one time, you know, you at that time were a member, I know you're not now, but, you know, we were the only 2 brown people probably in the party for a very long time. And that does worry me. And I don't think we've done the hard yards to actually engage multicultural communities to join us. But there's a very exciting pre-selection process happening in Victoria at the moment to replace Senator Richard Di Natale. And there's 3 or 4 people of color who have put their hand up for that pre-selection, you know, including Lydia Thorpe, who was the first Indigenous woman MP in the Victorian Parliament. So, you know, that has been part of my mission, and why I put my hand up for the Senate is because I want to, you know, kind of engage more with people of color and, you know, bring them in the party and bring them in the movement.
Awesome. We are getting close to 2 p.m. So probably time for us to kind of wrap up because everyone has to finish their lunch and get back to their days. But before we sort of just you know, do the final bits of housekeeping, I wonder, Mum, on the big questions that we sort of tackled, and I guess where we started, which is the sense of, do we feel optimistic about the challenges and opportunities presented by the crisis, or do we feel pessimistic? And I feel like at different moments you seem to reflect both. You know, you thought that there was an opportunity to connect with people, to start these conversations about these visionary sort of ideas, but then you also acknowledged some pessimism in terms of what the government is actually doing. If you had to take that all and weigh it all up, and say, if you think from this point going forward, are we in a better position to build a fairer society? What would you say?
I would say bugger the government. Yes, we are in a better position to build a better society. I am the eternal optimist. I couldn't do what I do every single day if I didn't have hope and optimism. And I do think that one of the big, I guess, advantages that we've had through this pandemic is that more and more people have realized how the inequalities play out on the community. And I've been speaking to a lot of people, you know, like I had a whole life before I even thought about coming into politics. So, you know, I have friends and acquaintances who vote every which way. And I have seen a lot of people who were quite conservative, you know, before the pandemic have really started talking about how terrible the systems are in Australia, that people, you know, can't pay rent and they're being forced to pay rent, or that international students are not getting the support that they need. So I think a lot of people are now much more aware of those, I guess, things that were hidden for so many people before this. And that kind of makes me optimistic that people might have more open minds to think of different ways of solving the issues that we still had before the pandemic, like the climate crisis and inequality, but we weren't really kind of captured by those different solutions. So I'm ever the optimist, and, you know, I'll keep fighting for what I think is required to make the changes that we need to make this world, not just Australia, but I think it has also made us realize that there are, you know, global connections that can help, because we need to change the world. It's not just our country that needs a change. It's a change that's required world over. So we can do this, but obviously we have to be much more vocal. And as one of my, who should I say, advisors at the University of New South Wales, when I was in a difficult position in my PhD and was thinking of giving up, said to me, Mehreen, feel the fear and do it anyway. So that's what I do.
Sounds like inspiration for a great tattoo. Thank you for that reflection. I just was thinking about how, obviously, like, you know, we've called and spoken during this period, but I don't think I've ever talked to you for like an hour nonstop. And probably, like you said, when we're talking on our own, it's more me getting agitated and not letting you get a word in, whereas this time I really had to sort of moderate myself, because I think people were really here to listen to you more than me. But thanks everyone for listening in. It's kind of surreal still that 100 people tuned in to hear me have a chat to my mum about politics and the world, but I really hope people got something from it. These are such fantastic sessions organized by a bunch of really fantastic groups. I just thank them: Principal, Co, The Guardian, Centre for Australian Progress, Essential, the Community Council for Australia, and the Australian Climate Foundation. What an amazing opportunity, just in terms of taking advantage of the difficulties of this crisis, of saying, why don't we all get together once a week and talk about ideas to make the world a better place. It was so nice to be invited to do it. So thank you so much for that. Everyone who attended and registered will get a follow-up email, and we encourage you guys to give feedback to that. We'll send the recording out. And there's a session next week, which is on universities, which we talked about a lot today, but we'll go into even more detail next week. So would encourage everyone to tune into that. And yeah, thanks again. Got a message saying Eid Mubarak for the weekend, Mum. I will hopefully speak to you before then, and hopefully get to eat some of your delicious food pretty soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you for providing this opportunity to speak to my son for 1 hour. I'm getting a little bit teary. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it.